For just a moment, She'd wondered why the man she had pinned didn't seem to react to her question, before her feral instincts died down enough to allow her to remember that he was, in fact, not conversational in GU. Taking a breath to refocus herself now that he was secured, while also still keeping a tight grip on him so it would stay that way, She'd concentrated for a moment. "What the hell are you doing here, Will?" she asked him once more, this time in heavily accented but still understandable English. Will's head tilted to the side a bit as he gazed up at her, and he began to chuckle really awkwardly. "Oh, cool. You remember me," he said, through his awkward chuckles, and visibly swallowed quite heavily. "And you learned our language. Nice hustle, girl." She'd increased the strength of her grip on him for a moment. Not strong enough to cause any damage, but certainly enough to be felt and send a message. "That's Lieutenant Commander to you," she said firmly, while glaring at him with narrow eyes. "Answer my question. What are you doing here?" "Lieutenant Commander? Wow, that's quite the jump in career. And can I say, you look great in that uniform. Much better than that white one you used to— Ouch!" Will awkwardly tried to distract her from the conversation. However, he was quite firmly interrupted when Sheeda's grip on him inadvertently strengthened even more as he began talking about her old uniform. Her eyes narrowed down at him even further, and the intensity of her breath slightly increased. "Alright, sore topic, I get it," Will pressed out as he adjusted to the new pressure. Sheeda was not amused. "Tell me what you are doing here, right now," she said firmly, and her grip relaxed slightly, going back to a more controlled hold. Will stared up at her for a moment, his blank breath filter not allowing for any insights into his current emotions, although his slight squirming indicated that he was really struggling with himself. "I, want a lawyer?" he finally brought out, very unsurely, and going by his tone, and the way he was tilting his face away from her as he said it, it very much seemed like he was fully expecting her to punch his face in for the statement. Admittedly, for a moment, Sheeda had half a mind to keep on insisting. She was close to getting answers here. Still, she had made a promise recently, and so she breathed in deeply through her nose and out slowly through her mouth. "You have the right to remain silent," she said. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to be represented by a lawyer. If you can't afford—" "You're seriously arresting me?" Will piped up in what sounded like honest confusion. Slowly he tilted his head back up towards Sheeda, seemingly now confident that he wasn't going to get punched. "Can you do that?" Sheeda sighed. She quickly finished telling him his rights, before she lessened herself to actually answer. "I am a Lieutenant Commander of the UHSDF. You best believe I can do that," she replied, with a firm expression. "And from now on you probably shouldn't say anything without your lawyer anymore." Will still seemed slightly befuddled. "Is this even your jurisdiction?" he wondered, as Sheeda started to climb off him in a controlled fashion to pull him to his feet. "Have you requested and been granted official sanctuary in the Lacheset or any other territories?" Sheeda asked him, as she kept a tight hold of his arm while pulling him to his feet. "Yes," Will said after a long pause, his tone alone revealing what he said to be a lie. Sheeda sighed. "In that case, yes, it is our jurisdiction," she informed him. In the meantime, she could hear more footsteps approaching them. Sheeda was a lot faster than her human colleagues, and so she had gotten quite the head start. However, she also hadn't sprinted full tilt, meaning that it hadn't taken too long for the others to catch up to her. "Who's that?" Coco asked, as they all caught up in a loose run, her confused gaze focused on the human, who was in the process of getting arrested by Sheeda. The vague projection of her actual expression didn't give away too much, but she was very clearly concerned. "His name is William Jones," Sheeda replied, the name coming back to her memory like divine intervention, while Andrzej hurried over to her to aid her in holding the man secure, since they didn't have any cuffs or anything similar with them. His rights had been read, and he requested a lawyer. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am," Will said, with strain in his voice, while Andrzej and Shida held him securely. "Always glad to be supporting our troops." Coco's stance hardened as she took in the scene. "A comedian, huh? Well, he'll get his lawyer," she said, and waved them along while pulling out her phone. "I'll request a holding cell from the lecture set. They'll probably be interested in what he has to say as well." As he was pulled along by the two holding him, Will briefly struggled a bit to try and stay in place, pressing his heels into the ground. "Hey, I get that you're arresting me and all that, but right now is a really bad time for that," he tried to argue, while doing his best to make himself unmovable, to rather moderate success given that Shida and Andrzej could both have individually overpowered him. "If you could just, tell me where to go and I'll come back there in an hour, that'd be great." Andrzej stared at him, while pulling him along. "You're not seriously trying this," he said, with mild disbelief in his voice. Quite obviously, Will knew that this had no chance of working, and at this point, he wasn't even wasting time. However, Will was seriously trying it, still straining not against being held itself, but just against being taken along. "No, really, I can't get arrested right now, but I'll gladly let you do it later. I mean, you've already got me, you earned it. I just need to do something real quick," he said, while still digging in his heels. "But you got my word that I'll find you later. Really, honestly, a pinky promise, Scout's honor." Although he very clearly tried to keep up his pretend cheerful and cheeky demeanor, Shida clearly noticed some desperation creeping into his voice over time, as it became clearer and clearer that he quite obviously wasn't going to get out of this one. "Whoever you have an appointment with, they will most likely agree that you being arrested is a quite valid reason to not show up for it. In fact, as you are getting arrested, they will most likely prefer that you not show up for it," Andrzej informed him, in a serious tone, as Shida had been just about to ask Will what exactly was so important. For a moment, she wondered if the Major had not caught on to the tone of the man's desperate voice. However, she knew that Andrzej was smarter than that. He had to be deliberately ignoring it. That much was even further confirmed by the fact that Coco didn't say anything on the topic at all. Will very apparently grew more desperate by the moment. "Listen, I really have to go," he said, and now as she started to half-heartedly try to tear loose from Andrzej's and Shida's hold. It really seemed like he could absolutely not make up his mind on whether he wanted to cooperate or not, and the desperation taking hold of him seemed to make him more erratic. "There's a bathroom in the holding cell, I'm sure," Andrzej said, with a completely calm and professionally firm tone, doing an honestly amazing job at pretending like he was entirely oblivious to Will's plight. It was around then that Shida understood that he was simply adding fuel to the fire, without actually needing to do anything. "Listen, it's important," Will said, and tried to pull his arm free with a desperate yank, which in the end only earned him an even tighter hold. The only thing Shida didn't quite understand was why he was this desperate to both do whatever he needed to, and not tell them anything about it. "What could possibly be so important that we would let you walk away here?" Andrzej now asked, clearly having taken over the conversation completely at this point. I didn't even do anything," Will defended himself with one last desperate yank. Then, however, he stopped his struggling and left his head hanging. "Listen, I didn't want to reach for this," he said, in a very breathy, hushed tone that was seemingly intended to underline just how serious he was being. "But lives are on the line." He lifted his gaze only slightly to look up directly at Coco, obviously having pinned her down as the highest-ranking person here. Coco didn't say anything. However, Andrzej managed to complete his masterpiece of playing someone entirely oblivious, as he asked, "Is that supposed to be a threat? So you really shouldn't say any more without your lawyer. Sheeta didn't know if that was exactly what Andrzej was playing at. However, one way or another, it seemed to work. What? No. Obviously that's not... Will snapped a bit for a second, before all the energy he had for it left him, and he slumped into Andrzej's and Sheeta's arms, almost to the point where it seemed that he couldn't stand on his own for a moment. Listen, he said, in a voice that sounded more than just exhausted, and it really seemed like all the fight he had left in him was leaving at once. Screw it, this is ridiculous, and getting arrested is not the worst thing in the world. I've got nothing left to lose anyway. He caught himself only slightly, bringing his feet firmly onto the ground again, so Sheeta and Andrzej didn't have to hold him up anymore. He then nodded his head in the direction of the shopping bag he had dropped earlier. You want tea? I'll give you tea, he said, his voice hardening. The store is a front. It peddles Deathworld-friendly wares officially, and when you know the right people, you can buy stuff you can't usually get outside of Deathworld's in there as well. There's antibiotics in that bag. Strong stuff. Earth-grade stuff. Everyone stared at him for a moment before looking down at the bag. Coco walked over to pick it up, and she quickly collected the different cans that had rolled out of it after it fell to the ground during Sheeta's tackle. Any of them that says they contain eggs? Will said, and Coco quickly opened one of the cans containing pickled eggs. She stared inside for a moment before showing the contents to the others. As Sheeta glanced into it, she saw thick cooling material lining the insides of it, likely both cooling the actual contents and mimicking the weight a can like that was supposed to have, because the little bottle in the middle of it looked like it weighed absolutely nothing. Coco pulled the bottle out for a moment and inspected the label. Furrowing her brows as she read it, she turned for a moment and called out, Nia, could you take a look at this for me? After a moment, Nia emerged from behind a nearby corner, having seemingly stood back while allowing the professionals to handle the potentially dangerous situation. Now she quickly hurried over to help Coco inspect the bottle. Coco wordlessly handed it to her, and Nia picked it up with long fingers while looking down at the words on the label. Antibiotic indeed, Nia mumbled. This is mecafeodin. But what the hell were you trying to do with it? Are you planning a large-scale science experiment? So far, due to the demands for a lawyer, none of them had really asked the man any questions that could be misconstrued as them trying to coax him into waiving his rights. However, Nia wasn't here in any official capacity. What do you think I need antibiotics for? Will replied in a slightly allergic reaction, a bit of energy returning to him with his irritation. Nia just scowled at him. Well, I hope you weren't planning on giving this to people, she replied, in a very stern, lecturing tone. This stuff is laboratory use only, and for very good reason. It's not nearly specific enough to use on humans. It wouldn't just cure your infection, it would completely decimate all the bacteria in your body. Like, this is the stuff we use when we need to make sure there's not a single bacterium left in something. Will froze as he heard her explanation. Sheeta couldn't see his eyes, of course, but she was more than sure that they were widening under his mask. Nia saw his reaction and looked him dead in the face. You didn't give this to anyone, did you? She asked him, with the same stern voice, but a clear undertone of worry underneath. Will very slowly shook his head. The delivery only came today, he said, before staring squarely at Nia. You're not lying, are you? Nia heavily shook her head. No, this stuff is seriously dangerous. As far as toxicity is concerned, mecafeodin is weighed similarly to things like arsenic, she said. Thank your lucky stars Sheeta caught you when she did, because otherwise whatever infection you were trying to cure here would have been the least of your worries. Sheeta felt Will's arm strain against her hold, although it didn't seem like he was trying to rip himself loose. To her, it more felt like he was trying to reach for his head and had simply forgotten that he was currently being restrained in the process. "You mean, I could have," he said, and his legs seemed to give out under him again, much like they had earlier. Fuck. Shida now felt confident enough to actually speak up, feeling like at this point, they had proven that there was most likely an imminent enough danger that asking questions was justified. "Will, what's going on?" she asked him, easing up the slightest bit on the way she held his arm. Now more than ever, she remembered that he hadn't been alone the first time they had met. Will let out a deep sigh of pure frustration that sounded like it was directed at himself, before his voice lost all expression when he said, "I guess I'm making a habit of getting duped." He took a long look at the bottle that Nia was still holding. Then he let his head hang completely. "Listen, I'll cooperate. With everything. I don't care if you lock me up forever, but I need your help," he said, in a defeated tone. Nia looked over at Coco. "If he was desperate enough to have antibiotics smuggled in," she began to say, but Coco quickly waved her off. I know, she said reassuringly to Nia, before turning her attention over to Will. "Take us to your sick friends first. We can contact your lawyer while we're on our way." Will shook his head. "I don't think a lawyer is going to do us much good now," he said breathlessly. "You've still got the right to one," Andres said, letting go of his oblivious act, as Will turned and started to slowly lead them in the direction of wherever his friends were currently hidden. Will just shook his head again. "That's alright," he said. "I know when I'm messed up." A bit later, after also sending James and the others an update on the way, they arrived at what looked like a large storehouse. One where people could rent individual units to store any old stuff they didn't need for the moment, and didn't have room for, but also didn't want to throw away. The building was large and boxy, and strongly reminded Shida of the detention center before it had been destroyed. However, the inside of it as they walked in was far less modern and techy by design, and opted for a lot more space-efficient placement of its walls and rooms, instead of the security of having everything divided by rails and double walls. Once they reached the right one among the many, many large doors that led into the different units, Will quickly unlocked it with a tap of his hand against the bioscanner next to it, causing the large gate to loudly fold out of the way. As it opened, the first thing that hit Shida from the inside of it was the smell. Everyone else was wearing breath filters, and so they probably weren't going to notice it quite as strongly as she did. But the sheer stench that came from the inside of that room was almost overwhelming for a second. It bore all the hallmarks of an inhabited space that clearly was not meant to be inhabited. Bodily odour mixed heavily with the smell of both excretions and garbage that clearly could not be properly disposed of in a place like this, altogether forming an absolute gut punch of an aroma that now invaded Shida's nostrils and caused her to turn away for a second as she tried not to gag. And even worse, as a more subtle note mixed underneath the more dominant stenches, there was the discreet but very recognizable smell of sickness. It was subtle, but very clear to Shida's brain, as her ancestors had once relied on smells like this to pick the most sensible victim out from a group of prey. And the fact that she could smell it over everything that was going on in there meant quite obviously that it was only subtle in comparison. Undeterred by the smell, both because of his breath filter and due to likely being used to it at this point, Will immediately hurried inside. The unit itself was mostly empty, as the large space went nearly entirely unused, apart from a small area just in front of the wall opposite to the entrance. There, 2 mats were laid out on the ground, housing the bodies of 2 people on top of them. Upon their entering, one of the 2 had somewhat pushed themselves up to face them, while the other appeared entirely unresponsive. Her eyes having been drawn to the movement of the person pushing into a sitting position for a moment, Shida then looked around the mats, and her expression that was already unhappy due to the smell darkened even further. Garbage was littered around everywhere. Even though someone had clearly made efforts to pile it all into a corner at some point, it's clear that the effort had been given up on a while ago, and was now only maintained to the level that a certain footpath through the littered packaging and old, over-dirty clothes, rags, towels, and sheets was kept clear. Buckets of unclarified content that were standing not far away from the mats most likely explained where the smell of excretions was coming from. Given the amount, and the fact that she saw 3 people in total, she'd have suspected they had been hiding away in here for at least a bit more than a week. Just behind the mats, there were 2 large open bags that spilled their contents out into the area in front of them. Although said contents were pretty meager at this point, it almost seemed like these 3 had been living out of those bags almost exclusively, and by the looks of it, their supplies were coming to an end. It seemed that they wouldn't have had long before they needed to come out anyway, even if the infection had not been a factor. To Sheeta's surprise, the first one apart from Will to approach the 2 sickly people was Nia, who confidently stepped past Andrej and Coco to make her way over to the mats. Although Sheeta knew her as a very cleanly person, Nia didn't seem to pay even half a mind to the garbage and filth around her as she walked on the narrow footpath through it. "Will," the person who had pushed up into a sitting position mumbled. By the sound of it, it could only have been Rekka. She sounded raspy and weak, to the point where it seemed that she was slightly delirious even. Still, her eyes snapped over to Nia as she approached. "Who are these?" "Oh," she mumbled, as her eyes went further along the room, finally landing on their uniformed company. "I'm sorry, Rekka," Will said, as he knelt down next to his friend, immediately reaching for a water bottle that stood next to her mat to lift it up for her. "I messed up," he said in a breathy voice, and a sob escaping his lips made it clear that he was crying underneath his mask. "I messed up," he repeated with another sob. "I messed up, but they're here to help you." He quickly aided Rekka in unlocking the fastening of her own breath filter and pulling it off her face so he could help her take a few sips of water. Her movements were extremely sluggish and weak. However, as her mask was removed, Sheeta could see that her gaze underneath it was still firm and defiant, even as her grimy and dirt-filled hair stuck to her head. Sheeta had never seen her face before, of course, but she was still quite sure that she had looked nothing like that back when they had first met. Back then, the human woman had been fiery, direct, and extremely confident in herself. Now she looked so sickly that she may as well have been a ghost of her former self. She allowed Will to give her a quick sip of water before she spoke up sharply. "We don't," she started, but was interrupted by a brief coughing fit that forced her to lurch forwards as it rocked her body with each spasmic exhale. It took her a good 10 seconds before she was able to get it under control and speak up again. "We don't need their help." Will sighed. "Rekka," he said, and held her by the arm to help her stay upright. Meanwhile, Nia had knelt down next to the other mat, and she moved her hand to the neck of the person lying on it. That one had to be Ortal, then. The larger man still seemed completely unresponsive as Nia's hand touched his skin, but she quickly pulled it back almost immediately after making contact. "He's burning up," she said, and turned to her companions in an urgent movement. "We have to get him to a doctor fast." Coco and Andrej began moving immediately, hurrying over to Nia in order to offer any support she'd need. Sheeta, however, was stunned for just a moment longer. Just for a second, she stood there and tried to put the pieces together. What were these 3 doing here? Why were they hiding under these horrendous conditions? Were they actually involved in the attack? And if so, should they really help them? However, those doubts lasted only a very short moment before she also began to move. Because, as Will had said earlier, lives were on the line here. And quite clearly that overrode any doubts they might have about what kind of people they were helping here. Preserve lives wherever possible was one of the UHSDF's highest priorities. Seeing 3 people already aiding the unconscious person on the second mat, Sheeta instead hurried over to Will and Rekka to see if she could offer any support there. From what she remembered, the human woman had been quite fond of her when they first met, so maybe that would help in making her accept the offered help now. "What's happened to you?" She repeated her earlier question to Will, as she crouched down next to Will to look at the sickly pale and emaciated woman, who defiantly stared back at her for a moment. Rekka seemed to need a very long moment to even recognize the fact that she had seen the person in front of her now before, but as she did, and her eyes lit up slightly with recognition, her features softened just a little bit. Then she averted her gaze, and it looked like she did so in shame. "Hard times," she mumbled dismissively, clearly not willing to get out with it, either out of shame or out of any vague hope that she could still save her own skin if she only stayed quiet about what had happened to them. Sheeta shifted her gaze over to Will, who had already promised his cooperation in the matter. Now that he saw that the soldiers were here and really willing to help, it seemed that any hesitation he had left was melting away. He sighed as he got ready to confess. We're smugglers," he admitted straight out. "Obviously we didn't mention that during our first meeting, but yeah, that's what we do. Recently things got a lot harder for us, with most of Earth's borders shutting down for a while and humans becoming unwelcome guests in large parts of the galaxy. Finding proper work was hard, even for the likes of us. Or maybe especially for the likes of us. So when this job came along, we thought that we hit it big, and completely forgot to be careful in the process." As he spoke, his voice was still wrecked by the tears obviously flowing underneath his mask, and he could barely look at Sheeta's or Rekka's face. "What kind of job?" Sheeta asked suspiciously, which immediately caused Will to let out a sound that was somewhere in between a sob and a desperate, humorless laugh, as he needed to collect himself for a moment before he could reply. "We didn't know," Rekka said weakly, before Will had fully caught himself again. She was still looking away as well, but at least she seemed willing to talk now. Maybe she too was getting sick of the circumstances around her, and just wanted to trade it in for anything else. "It sounded like easy money, just people who didn't want to be pinned down easily. We could sort of relate to that." Right after she spoke, she bent over into another coughing fit, leaving Will to pick up the word in her stead. "We got an offer for a job a while ago. A group of human drifters, or at least that's who they claimed they were, said they needed an upgrade to their tech since theirs was getting faulty. Nothing fancy, just new breath filters. But they didn't want to go back to Earth themselves since they were afraid the government might keep them there," he explained. "They wanted something that'll last them a while, so they asked for the real modern stuff. It all sounded believable." Sheeta's ears perked up, and her eyes widened as she listened to him. "When you say real modern stuff, you mean," she began to say, but Rekka cut her off in between heavy coughs. "Military tech," she managed to press out, before gradually getting her breathing under control again. "We thought nothing of it because they're just filters. If we knew what they were going to do with them, we would have never taken the job." Will nodded along with his friend. "I promise that's the truth. We had no idea any of this was going to happen," he said, in an almost pleading tone, basically begging Sheeta to believe that they never planned for their services to lead to the devastating outcome that they had. "It sounded like just another normal job. We may move outside of the law, but we didn't want this." He broke off again as he got overwhelmed by emotion, seemingly wrecked with guilt. And it sounded like the guilt was not just coming from their work as smugglers, especially since he looked at Rekka as he broke down. Still, Sheeta was momentarily caught in a very brief flash of blind rage. It didn't last long enough for her to act on it, luckily, but still, a simmering ember remained. These three had played a part in this attack. A minimal and, if they were to be believed, involuntary one. But still, for just a moment, it was enough to make Shida absolutely furious. Still, that fury died down almost as soon as it had emerged, as she looked at the sickly form of Rekka, and glanced over as Coco and Andrej were gently lifting up Ortal. "Well," Rekka said, briefly interrupted by a much less violent cough this time, and Shida quickly looked at her as she spoke. "If it's any consolation, we got our just desserts for our lapse in judgment. Seems like these fellas don't like a loose end." She then broke out into even more coughing again. Shida looked at her for a moment before reaching out to help her stand up. "You'll tell us all about it later," she said, as she wrapped her arm around Rekka's to pull her to her feet. Still, as she spoke, her tone was firm and strict, leaving no doubt that that was exactly what they were going to be talking about later, and that Rekka or her companions better not leave out a damn thing. "For now, let's get you to someone whose medicine won't kill you." Over to her side, she could see that Coco and Andrej had absolutely no trouble also lifting Ortal up, given the local gravity. She looked over at Will, and she had no doubt he would willingly follow along with them, without needing to be held this time. It was time to get these people help, and then they would get answers.